As Vladimir Putin sends a mini fleet of warships and a nuclear submarine to Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, what is next for the tyrant's plans against the West?
Just inside a tank on our way into Gaza. There is rubble and destruction as far as you can see.
They're digging in their positions, they're practicing. Point accuracy over targets is what has transformed so much of this conflict.
This is World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and joining me today is Dr. Jack Watling, land warfare expert from the Royal United Services Institute think tank here in London. Jack, thanks so much for joining me. Lots happening. President Putin visiting North Korea, these warships off the coast of America, and of course the war raging in Ukraine. And I know you've been there a lot. As you see it today, what do you think Vladimir Putin is trying to achieve?
So there are three things. The first one is trying to isolate Ukraine from the West. The second is trying to convince the Ukrainians that they can maybe alter the timeline, but not the trajectory of the fight. And therefore, they need to move towards negotiations. And the third thing is essentially build a coalition of states that do not cooperate with the US and NATO on sanctions and on the international rules-based system, as it would be termed in London and Washington. And in fact, the point they would make is that they are in the global majority of states that have not imposed those sanctions. And so they want to essentially, as Putin always says, have a multipolar world. And part of that is Russia maintaining and expanding its relationships in Africa, in South America, in the Middle East, in areas where they are trying to challenge the West's relationships.
I mean, Jack, we're nearly 2.5 years into the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I mean, we can look at geopolitics more largely in terms of who's winning that battle for influence. But right now, who's winning the war in Ukraine?
Right now, I would say Russia is winning the war on the ground. It is an extremely messy process for the Russians. There's nothing elegant about how they're doing it, but they are slowly taking territory. The Ukrainians are losing capability relative to the Russians. And so that's not, the Russians are taking more casualties and more losses, but they're also replacing them faster than the Ukrainians are. And so we are in a position where unless we change how we're doing our business, the Russians are going to start compounding a lot of their advantages over the Ukrainians at the front.
What do you mean by change how we do business?
So in Ukraine's case, they need to change how they recruit and train their personnel, which is a major problem for the Ukrainians. That's not one we can help with. But then those new units need to have equipment. And in order to be able to deliver that equipment, we need to rationalize our industrial base. It's not just about investing in production. It's also about doing so in a way where we are generating an internally coherent supply chain in the West, rather than having, for example, parallel investments into artillery manufacture, where those artillery companies, ammunition companies, are then competing with one another to buy the base explosive energetics or nitrocellulose chemicals that they need to produce the ammunition. And so all that actually does is it doesn't drive the output up, because it's the same level of inputs in terms of material. It just drives up the price per munition. So we need to solve the industrial piece. The Ukrainians need to resolve the recruitment and retaining piece.
I mean, that's quite alarming, because it sounds like Russia can just carry on doing more of the same and it will continue slogging away and slowly winning, whereas Ukraine and the West need to take some difficult in terms of recruitment and complicated in terms of manufacturing steps. I mean, do you think Ukraine can win the war?
It's still possible, yes, but we are running ourselves perilously close to the point where we do not have enough runway left. I would note that that has been the case at multiple points over the last 2 years. I've been with the Ukrainians watching the national stockpile trickling down at various points and get very, very close to empty before things were released, decisions were made. And that effectively lengthens the runway, if you like. Exactly. So it can be done, but we don't have time. And if we look at the failure of the offensive last year, that was in no small part because we were too slow in making our decisions. So we have to not repeat that mistake.
What does Ukraine? So you've said it needs people,
Yeah,
to fight. It needs munitions and material that the West and its allies can provide. That only the West and its allies can provide.
Yep.
Are there other steps? Is there anything else that Ukraine needs to try and halt or turn the tide?
Well, I think the other question is, at the moment, the Russians are quite comfortable with the losses they're taking. They feel they can absorb them. They feel they can regenerate the forces. And so how do we change that equation? And the most effective way of changing that equation is actually money, because it's the fact that the Russians have such a large large capacity for selling natural resources and therefore generating cash that allows them to cover the increased costs of production and recruit more people. And so in Ukraine's case, the strikes on Russia's oil and gas infrastructure is something that is, in the long term or even the medium term, quite important for them in running down the other end of the equation. In the West's case, it is still the case that every single Russian complex weapon, the numbers that they're producing is going up, relies upon critical components manufactured in the West and material procured from the West. And so
Chips.
Microelectronics, nitrocellulose, machine tooling, they're still getting a huge amount of machine tooling from around Europe and the US. And that's what is allowing them to expand the production lines for a lot of their weapon systems. And so we need to cut that off. It's all very well us going to countries that we were discussing previously and say, you need to join the sanctions regime. But when we are failing to enforce the sanctions that we've already passed, then a lot of countries look at it and say it's ineffective. So we need to close those loopholes.
And even if we manage somehow to choke off this sort of incredibly complicated network of trade which allows dual-use equipment to make it into Russia.
It's not actually that complicated. It's doable. The problem is that it does come with an economic cost for us, right?
Okay.
So when a Russian company comes to a German manufacturer and says, I have never imported anything before, but I want X number of 1,000 units to be imported into Kazakhstan, even though I have no factory there that can do anything with them, rather than us saying, actually, yeah, that's fine, we have to say, no, that's not. The problem is that German company will then actually lose out on sales because of the loss of Russian business. So it comes at an economic price.
It comes at an economic price. It comes potentially at the greed of Western businesses prepared to put their profits before the fate of Ukraine.
Well, a lack of political will by politicians to explain why that price has to be borne.
And yet, even if we achieve this, which you say is achievable, we see Vladimir Putin, cozying up to China, cozying up to Pyongyang in North Korea. I mean, how important is the supply of those weapons, those artillery shells we understand from Korea, the drones from Iran? I mean, even if we choke the supply of parts from the West, is he not able to sustain himself based on Russia's manufacturing capability and these alliances he's made with?
He will still be able to fight. He will still be able to generate weapon systems, but they will be less effective and less reliable, and they will cost him more. So it still has an effect. In terms of the Iranian drones, they are also critically dependent on a lot of the same microelectronic components from the West. So actually, it's a common failure on our part, and it's the same problem.
And finally, let's talk about the naval activity happening around Cuba. Obviously, reminiscent in some ways. Cuba synonymous with crises and threats to the United States and Russian sort of geopolitical gambling, if you like. What is Putin? Do you think he will succeed in achieving anything by making this show of force in the Caribbean?
I think he will. Which is showing his partners in South America that Russia still has the ability to engage and to project there, and therefore underwriting the credibility of any commitments that he then wants to make in a negotiation. And that's not just with Venezuela and with Cuba, but there are a number of governments in South America who aren't necessarily hostile to having interactions with the Kremlin. And so in terms of competition, having a presence there is a starting point for being able to try and maintain leverage in South America. We've seen them achieve the same thing in Africa, getting the US kicked out of Niger most recently, and it won't be the last country in Africa either. And so, this is a fairly developed, deliberate strategy, which we ignore at our peril. Just on Africa, where do you see Russia making gains in the other countries you think that America may be kicked out of soon? I wouldn't want to start saying this is where it's going to happen, but if you look at where the Russians are engaging quite extensively, they're engaging in Guinea, they're engaging in Chad, they're obviously heavily invested in Sudan, although in that case the US has already left. So they have a number of countries where they are trying to expand their influence, and we've already seen them have international partners kicked out of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And so there is a pattern here, right? And Central African Republic before that, which means that we can't be complacent about it. Jack, thank you very much for joining me today. This is World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you have any questions for me or for Jack, please ask them in the comments below, and we will do our best to answer some of them next time.